Hello, everyone. Welcome to this live panel discussion on decolonizing queer academia, LGBTQ plus experiences beyond the Western lens. I'll just give everyone a moment to join before we begin. I know it can take a little time for it all to pop up. Okay, so I'm going to begin with some quick housekeeping. This panel is being recorded and will be shared with everyone who registered a few days after the event. We're also going to share any resources mentioned in the panel after the event. And after our main discussion, there will be time for audience questions at the end. So if you have a question, please submit it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Now we've got all that out of the way, introduce myself. I'm Gemma Ware. I work at the independent, not-for-profit news organisation, The Conversation, where I host our podcast, The Conversation Weekly. So basically that means that my job is to interview academics around the world about a multitude of topics around their research and also their perspectives on current news. So it's a really great job and I learn a lot every day. I'm very lucky. And I'm sure we'll also all be learning a lot today in this panel because we're joined by a fantastic group of academics and researchers. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves. Adnan, could I ask you please to go first? If you would.
Thank you very much. My name is Adnan Hossain. I'm an interdisciplinary social scientist with a strong commitment to bridging the gap between theory and practice. And I'm currently based out of the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Glasgow.
Great, Adnan. Great to have you with us. Daniel, would you like to go next?
Thanks for having me. And I just wanted to say that as an introduction, I usually say that I'm wearing a couple of hats at the same time. So I'm an academic, an independent researcher. I work on gender and sexuality and queerness in South Asian public culture primarily, but with a little bit of work on Southeast Asia, particularly Singapore. But I'm also one of the co-founders of an organization, a network, and a platform called Queer Asia that started in 2016. And we've been doing various things inside and outside and adjacent to academia for the past 8 years. And we're based in London and Berlin, but also are slowly growing a chapter in Delhi now, which is quite exciting. And I left academia over the course of the pandemic, so I'm in some ways, one of those people who was part of the precariat, I think, just needed to find different ways to survive. So academia was not one of those places. So these are sort of some of the hats that I'll be wearing today, and I'm looking forward to being in conversation with some amazing people.
Yeah, absolutely. And great to have you, Daniel. Thank you. Mikee, can I ask you to go next, please?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mikee Inton-Campbell. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am assistant professor at California State University, San Marcos, where I teach trans and queer of color studies. I basically teach intro to trans studies and sexuality studies courses. I do research on film in Southeast Asia, but I also do research with sex workers. As with Daniel, I also wear multiple hats. We're very fond of hats, aren't we? I am an activist. I'm part of the board of directors of the International Trans Fund right now. So looking forward to hearing from everyone today.
Great, and looking forward to your contributions too, Mikee. And last but not least, we have Saskia. Please, can you introduce yourself as well?
Thank you, Gemma. I'm Saskia Weiringa. I've been an activist in socialist, feminist, and particularly lesbian circles since the late 60s, early 70s. I've done research on LGBT issues for over 40 years. I'm now a retired professor of women's same-sex relations cross-culturally at the University of Amsterdam. I've worked in various countries in Africa, but also primarily in Indonesia. And I just published the political biography of the Indonesian LGBT movement and with Bloomsbury. And I hope to be going on for quite a few decades doing research and being an activist and teaching. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all of you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this discussion and getting into it because we've got a lot of ground to cover and there's lots to talk about. I'm going to start with a bit of kind of context, a bit of history, if we could. So, how do you think? And I'll ask this to you first, Saskia, if you don't mind. How do you think the field of LGBTQ plus studies has evolved since you started your research journey?
Well, when I started doing actual research on LGBT relations in the early 1980s, we had developing and well, quite mature already human rights and lesbian and gay rights movement in the West, but hardly anything going on in the South. And when I said I wanted to do research on women's same-sex relations in Indonesia particularly, but also in Africa, they told me I was ethnocentric. You only have lesbians in Amsterdam and San Francisco, Saskia. There are no lesbians in the rest of the world. So please don't import that issue into the third world, Saskia. So I turned my back on this kind of research and started doing my work in Africa and in Asia, particularly Indonesia. And what I came across is that there are a number of issues which are very different if you do research in a Western context or in a
Oh, I think we're losing Saskia slightly. Oh, okay. There you are back again. Yeah. Sorry, a number of issues that are different, you were saying, in different contexts. Yeah.
Do you want to hear more about that now?
Yes, sorry, it's just that you cut out slightly. So if you, just.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
quite different. Like in Amsterdam, where I'm situated, I'm now in The Hague. In Amsterdam, we had a history of decriminalization and medicalization, and later human rights and lesbian and queer rights. In Africa and Indonesia, we have an imported homophobia in a situation in which most same-sex relations were not criminalized, and an import of of bourgeois morality, and then later on in independence, a form of what I would call post-colonial amnesia, in which those earlier histories were ignored. And the country was seen as always already heterosexual. And so the human rights, and we'll talk about that later, and queer rights movement had to be built upon this kind of context of a post-colonial amnesia in which the now brown and black and yellow and whatever non-white leaders of the countries were reimposing the kind of laws of which colonial bourgeois morality had brought into the country.
Fascinating. It's changed a lot in the years that you've been studying it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
What about you, Adnan? How do you think the field has evolved since you started doing research?
Well, I mean, compared to Saskia, maybe, I haven't been in the field for that long, but maybe around 10, 15 years, actively, like as an academic or wearing that academic hat. But in my case, I've been involved actually from around the late 90s, when I was an undergraduate student, and not necessarily with an active interest to become an academic. I became an academic accidentally, but more as a sort of an organizer. So that line was always blurred in my case. But one of the things that I want to bring to the table is that I see today queer studies, broadly speaking, as a lot more mainstream and a lot more institutionalized than it was, I think in the past. And part of the effects, or one of the effects of this institutionalization has been, the way queer studies has lost its ability to maintain its anti-normative positioning, and so that's one of the things that I'm actually particularly interested in, and what does that mean for queer studies to be institutionalized, a field that emerged in opposition to, sort of, institutions' disinclination to accommodate, right? So, I think that's one of the issues that I am actually quite troubled by, the inability of queer studies to maintain its anti-normative positioning, and also the different ways it is becoming complicit with the reproduction of the status quo, not only in relation to how gender and sexual subjectivities and identities are organized in the Western context, but also in terms of in terms of these fields' a complicity with with reproduction and perpetuation of various kinds of ideologies that legitimize broader structural inequalities and ideologies, like the war that is happening today, and I expect a field like queer studies to be at the center of critiquing, but which I do not necessarily see. So of course it is a lot more institutionalized. There are many universities that offer queer studies, but it has become just yet another subject, on offer. But maybe it is becoming stripped of its radical potential. And I don't know what we can do to kind of, bring that back. So that is what I would say. And I think I would like to hear from others, but of course from Saskia, what can be done to address the problem. Yeah.
I'm sure we'll get into that later. I mean, earlier, Mikee, I saw you nodding when Saskia was talking there about the colonial legacies affecting kind of research. And I wonder, in what ways do you think colonial legacies still influence LGBTQ plus research today?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, but it's also a very broad question because, like, what isn't colonialism? If you wanted to be cheeky about it, because like everything that we have today is created out of colonial legacies, right? So when the trans exclusionary radical feminists in Great Britain are talking about biology as an essential, that is part of the colonial project, the erasure of trans and indigenous forms of queerness. It was a result of the spread of the Abrahamic religions, but also there are broader questions that we can kind of bring into this conversation, questions of legibility, of translation, but also questions of, and this is something that I personally struggle with, the troublings of these categories. As Adnan has mentioned, we end up kind of reproducing these colonial constructs, the status quo. So what does it mean to be trans outside of the Western viewpoint, I think is something that is a question that's becoming much more prominent in queer studies, trans studies today. Oh, you're on mute, Jenna.
Apologies. Yeah, I was just saying, Daniel, would you like to come in on that question about the colonial legacies as well? Where do you see that influencing research today in your work?
So I wanted to introduce, and this is something that all three of the speakers have also touched on a little bit, but I wanted to introduce materiality into this conversation about colonial legacies and how we continue to do research. I think materiality in who can do research, how they can do research, under what constraints they can do queer research, very importantly informs who's excluded from the work of research and who, in fact, it's almost aspirationally excluded. People don't necessarily see themselves as researchers. They don't necessarily see their sort of areas of interest being not just represented, but possible. And, there are many layers to this. So I wanted to sort of bring this alive a little bit from some of the struggles that we've been talking about and writing about. And so when I say we, I'm talking about the Queer Asia Network. So in our book in 2019, which was published in 2019 called Queer Asia, Reimagining and Decolonizing Gender and Sexuality, we talk about, in fact, the material constraints in very hard borders that are not crossable by queer people of color coming from Asian contexts. And in fact, in one of our exhibitions, I think a few years later, in 2018 and 2019, we had an installation that was just rejected visa letters. So that's just a very simple example of, people who weren't able to come despite the fact that they were fully funded. But, when someone like Mac Brim talks about poor queer studies in the global north, I think it's really interesting to take that conception and think about what queer studies might even look like in the global south, where we're seeing this burgeoning of institutions that are private institutions, private education, where inequality is the fundamental premise on which, a discipline like queer studies can exist within a private institution. As someone who went to a public university, and I think in India, the concept of a public university is it's a government-run, publicly funded university. The access to education was a really low cost. It was at a really low cost. So when we're thinking about queerness and how queerness in the ways in which queer studies or LGBTQ studies is, sort of spreading across the globe, I guess. Now, as part of this edited collection on queer Southeast Asia, where we talk about this as well, in Singapore and Thailand, where the people who are able to do queer research are coming in from a class-based privilege. In India or in South Asian contexts, it's a caste-based privilege. And those, of course, are intersectional, based in gender, based in sexuality, and in other ways and forms, disability and so on. So I think in many ways, the colonial legacies that inform, so just coming back to that question, colonial legacies today that I see informing queerness are very much deeply embedded in the material structures around which queer studies is now possible, whether in the global north or whether in the global south. And, the visa question is so important because, again, universities and the ways in which they're structured, particularly in the UK over here, rely increasingly on international students and exorbitant fees, actually, that international students need to pay in order to come here to then research their home countries, because those colonial legacies have made that research impossible. I remember this time when I was in Singapore and I was studying at NUS, it was really hard for me to even access some of the books that I was looking at for my research, right? And it was only when I came to the UK that suddenly I was like able to go to the British Library or go to look at knowledge that has been gate-kept behind this border. And, the discursive impossibilities, I guess, of doing queer research, and the material impossibilities have been exported to my home country or to places where many of us come from. So I think the material plays a really important role in how these colonial legacies now continue to live on. And this is such an important thing because it's part and parcel of how we navigate these systems on an everyday basis, and we don't stop to recognize them. We don't stop to look at them. They've disappeared into these impossibilities that, you could just dismiss as that's someone's visa problem, which, a researcher from the global north doesn't have to face when they have to go do field work somewhere else. But it does work the other way around. I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. That's really, there's a lot there, what you said, and about the different kind of challenges facing the field. I wonder if we can move on a bit and kind of dig deeper into those unique challenges, I guess, faced by queer communities. And Saskia, perhaps you could point to some examples from your own research here of challenges faced by communities that are not typically addressed in Western queer studies amongst the people that you've been working with.
You want me to answer this?
Yes,
Is it directed at me?
Yeah.
Sorry, because
okay,
I couldn't quite follow. I couldn't quite follow. Well, the material issues, of course, are important. I mean, as Daniel rightly said, I have hardly had any research money for this kind of work because it's almost impossible to get funding. Maybe now, when Western universities are fielding big research projects. But when I started this kind of work, and for the first 35 years, I had no funds. So I did it all in my own time while I was doing other work to keep myself financially afloat. So that is there. The material issue is very difficult for queer studies. That having said, it is, I think, what is also very important is the hierarchical relationships between Western researchers who, even in my case, with very few resources, had at least some time for research, and the researchers in Africa or Indonesia, right, or in our case also in India, where we did research. What I often see is that, I mean, in a research project, which is community-based, as most of our research is, right? I mean, the researchers depend heavily, and they should depend heavily, on the collaboration and the insights of the people that they work with, that they do research on and with, right? I would insist on the with. You do research with people. I mean, I became friends with the community of lesbians that I finally wrote about long before I ended up doing a bit of research on them. And then only when they asked me to do research, right? When they asked me to write their histories. Now, the issue then is of hierarchy. If you work with these people, and it's a long project, I insist that this kind of work should be long also, should be longitudinal, this kind of research, not being based on quick and dirty kind of interview questions. Then the issue of authorship comes up. What I see very often in this kind of studies is that the Western researcher claims the sole authorship, but yet the book, which is the article, which is the product, the academic product of this.
Oh, we've lost you again. Oh,
and this for me is a fallacy. This to me is an absolute fallacy. In some cases it is correct. It is really that work of that particular author. But in other cases, joint authorship and recognizing the intellectual authorship of the people that you worked with is, I think, also very important. So apart from breaking material boundaries, we should also break down the hierarchical boundaries between the West and the global South.
Yeah. Do any of the rest of you want to come in on that? Has that happened with any of your experiences and the queer communities in your research area?
Yeah, well,
sorry,
I mean,
just, Adnan or sorry.
Adnan, sorry, yes, of course.
No, go ahead,
Yes.
Saskia, go ahead,
Yes,
finish.
yeah.
It's all right. No, Saskia, you can finish.
Yeah, you go.
No, so I mean the both the points about hierarchy brought in by Saskia and the question of materiality, brought done are very well taken and very important. But to this, I also want to add, like, in relation to the question about how coloniality or colonialism continues to inform research, is this question of how ideas, concepts, and categories that emerge in the West are assumed to have universality, and it's a question of how community that one writes about are represented. So that is, to me, is a more subtle form of coloniality that continues to inform how you write, and it's almost impossible because we're writing mostly for Western audience, for Western consumption, because that's where the market is. And also part of the problem is, of course, it's not just about like words, it's about cognitive bias. It's about, so these categories are products of particular histories. So to work, so I think, so one of the ways I try to sort of deal with it is to kind of think of the concepts we're thinking with, rather than taking those concepts, for granted and then using them to kind of subject whatever, diversity that we're encountering. So that to me is a continuous challenge, right? Like, how do you sort of deal with that? Like this kind of colonialism, at the conceptual level or at the level of language and how we write, and almost it's inescapable, right? So I felt that that's is perhaps I think important, but also relatedly, I was thinking about inequalities in knowledge production. I mean, this is an issue that has been brought up, but also there is this profound paradox that as scholars from the global South, we have to be educated in the global North, even to be an expert in our own society. Right, so there's this post-colonial paradox, and also the way global South continues to be the source of data, right? And North is where you do theory building or knowledge production, in issues that Saskia just brought up. And the only way we can dismantle or disrupt is by being critical of the structural inequalities. And those structural inequalities are issues that should be at the heart of queer studies, not just talking about including people that are non-heterosexual or or non-dimorphic in terms of the gender preferences. So so I think these interlocking systems of oppression are so much important, and I think that's where I expect queer studies to be sort of drifting towards and centering those issues. Yeah.
Great. I want to move on because I think it would be good to get into some kind of the more detail of people's research. Mikee, can I turn to you with this next question, which is about how representations of LGBTQ plus people in local media, film, popular culture actually influence your research? And how would you say that that compares with the influence of Western media on queer identities too?
This is also another interesting question that kind of is very difficult to address because it's so broad. My research is primarily centered on trans representation in cinema. I did that in the Philippines, and I'm doing it in Southeast Asia. And if you compare that with quote unquote Western representations of transness, the Trans Tipping Point in 2013 came out with when Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine. And then if you look at non-Western media, you see that the trans people have always been there. So it's kind of like the West is finally catching up to forefronting trans and queer issues and queer representation in the media. But there's also kind of this evolving landscape of the media where, because of social media, because of TikTok, YouTube, and all of these influencer cultures, more queer people, more trans people from the global South are able to speak for themselves, which I think is a really empowering thing. But also, academics aren't really studying that. And in my preliminary research, and in my work with some of my students as well, we're kind of identifying certain themes that have been emerging as the time goes along. And the thing that a lot of, especially young queer people from the global South and the global North are trying to forefront is joy, is community, is that, you know, we're tired of being victimized. We're tired of being thought of as this oppressed, marginalized community. No, we have community, we have joy, we have happiness and purpose and life. So it's kind of like the democratization of knowledge production is very interesting to me through these different platforms. And of course, within the context of rising anti-trans rhetoric, anti-trans legislation in the US and in other places, it becomes even much more important for these communities to be able to speak for themselves rather than have someone write about them. Because that's also one of the challenges that I wanted to kind of bring up. We're kind of tired of being studied. Like, we can do our own research. We can speak for ourselves. And as an activist, that hat never comes off for me.
I actually chaired a panel a couple of years ago with Sage on the very subject of queer joy, which was joyful and celebratory. So maybe we can put a link to the old recording of that to showcase some of that great research. Does anyone else want to come in on this question of kind of media, local media, film, and popular culture, and how that influences your research? Daniel, perhaps.
Yeah, I just wanted to thread two pieces of conversation together. So I really liked and resonated with what Saskia and Adnan were talking about in the earlier response. And, you know, I think the question around queerness traveling from the West to the rest, if you will, is very much embedded in different modalities. So, I mean, there is one where it is discursively traveling in terms of knowledge and knowledge production and who has access to knowledge production, but it's also embedded in representation traveling through media, through the consumption of culture. And, you know, I think this is quite interesting because it's when you think about where the media is being produced and what is the quality of the media that's being produced, a lot of it is America-centric. It's dominated by America, and to the point that, there's erasure even in the UK, for instance, of their own queer histories and their own queer knowledges. And, I'm talking about mainstream cultures. I'm not even talking about minoritized queer people of color within the UK. But when you think about that consumption of media, whether through, Mikee mentioned TikTok, and whether through, Instagram and things like that, the ways in which these algorithms are determining what young people consume ends up having, again, and I keep coming back to the material because I think it's so important, ends up impacting the ways in which people interpret queerness for themselves, even within the global south, such that when you're doing, so some of the research that I was doing in looking at queerness in South Asian public culture going into the colonial period, and before that, we end up looking for certain things that don't necessarily have resonances, because these are the ways in which those discourses are impacting our understanding of what queerness might look like, or how we might find or how queerness might find legibility within those contexts, to the point that it becomes then a project of recovery or justification for finding different and alternative modalities and ways of being queer. And one of the pieces of research that I was doing recently, we were looking into the work of the South Asian poet Kamala Das, and she was writing around the same time as Michel Foucault was writing in the 60s, and she uses the word queernesses in English in India. In India around that time, and we don't necessarily see that as a resonant modality of queerness, because we're so focused on the Western dominated idea of what queer looks like, what the sort of the heritage, I guess, if you want, of queer studies is, which is Western focus, which Adnan was pointing out. So, to representational politics, then queer then becomes a certain kind of formation, and that, I think, gets embedded in class-based structures again. So people feel excluded based on where they're not adequately replicating or reproducing a certain kind of queer identity formation. And the implications for this are extensive, whether you go into thinking about people's self-representation on Grindr, or apps like that, or whether you go into thinking about how people are engaging with popular culture.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, so we've got a lot of questions coming in, which is great. Just a reminder, if you have some questions, do put them in on the chat, and I want to leave some time at the end to get to them. So I'm going to move on to kind of talking about something we've already covered a little bit, but it'd be great to get some more contributions from you all about this, which is about kind of the challenges faced by researchers who are studying LGBTQ plus communities outside the Western context. Daniel, you were talking about some of, and Adnan, both of you were talking about this. Mikee, perhaps I can turn to you. How have you gone about navigating these challenges in your own research?
It's very difficult to, again, address this question. It really does kind of depend on the context that you're studying. And I'm going to speak about my own research, my own ongoing research with sex workers here in California. So what I do is I just hang out with them, and we talk, and when we are in community together, there are things that there's drug use, there's marijuana, there's all of these things that are not supposed to be part of formal academic research. And then when I go to my university and I ask the ethics committee, like, what do I do with this? They're kind of like, we don't actually know because it's illegal, right? And then that also kind of brings up the point of criminalization, which is, I think, something that queer communities around the world deal with, particularly in post-colonial contexts, when whether it's India dealing with section was it 377, which was recently overturned, Singapore as well, and then how these laws are kind of referencing each other. Taiwan and Thailand, for example, are the first two countries in Asia that have enacted marriage equality. And so the activists in the Philippines are also going, hey, they have marriage equality. Why can't we have marriage equality? And the other activists in the Philippines are going, we don't even have divorce. Like, we don't even have democracy. So like, what do you even kind of forefront in these conversations, right? So I wanted to kind of go back to what Saskia was talking about, that when we're doing research with these people, it's very, very important that we're not just reproducing the colonial gaze and turning them into subjects that are being studied. It's very important to highlight their agency and to highlight the nuances of these discussions and these conversations, because movements are diverse. It's very difficult to kind of have everyone on the same page. It's never going to happen. So how do you make sure that these diverse voices are being honored and being represented, but also making sure that there is a critical engagement with the questions that arise from these movements? And yeah.
Saskia, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, that's nice. There are two issues that I would like to get involved with in this conversation. First of all, the issue that Mikee raised. I mean, to do research with. I mean, when I first came into the field, I was doing a dangerous research on communist women's organizations, which exposed me to a lot of state repression. And I desperately needed friends. And so I became friends with a group of lesbians, and we just went out. We hang out together, like Mikee said, right? We went to discos. I mean, we engaged in all kinds of friendship and integrated love relationship and whatever. I mean, I was just part of that movement. And then when they started organizing themselves, I joined in with them. It was their initiative. I joined in with them. And I recorded everything. I mean, being an anthropologist in the field, you always record. I mean, you've got your book with you and you record. And so, and these notes now of about more than 40 years ago are part of my of my present research academic work. At that time, it was not academic work at all. I was just friends with them, and we went out together. We had huge parties. We evaded the police. We did all those kinds of things that that would never fit into any kind of regular research context. So it wasn't research; it was friendship. That was the basis of my work in the early 80s. It later became research when, after I had done the work on the communist women's movement, and I had, what they said, given back their history to them and their honor, then my first friends from 15 years ago came back to me and they said, Saskia, you know us, we trust you. We have suffered a lot under Suharto regime also. We have lost our history. We don't know who we are. We have no historical background. And please, could you write our history for us? So, and then only then I started some kind of formal researching with more participatory observation in all the various groups that they had diverse into and things and so on. And I think that kind of research is much more valuable than some of the quick and dirty PhD projects I see nowadays, when people go into the field for half a year and then they come back and write a big book and things and so on, and they think that they've done everything. And I'm very much against this kind of work. I would very much advocate the kind of work in which you establish a link first with the community and then gradually move into doing research. That is not the way at this moment PhD projects I know are being organized, and I deplore that, and I will fight against that to my last drop of life. Anyway, the other question I would like to discuss is about the relationship between the global movement, the so-called global movement, and what is called the rest, because that is, I think, based on a lot of misunderstanding. The first misunderstanding is that what happens in the West is global. Yet this is seen by both the West and by people in the global south sometimes, not always, fortunately. And I think this is a big misunderstanding. It is as if the history of the Western movement is the default history, so to speak, and the history of what happens in the South is not part of that move, is still the other, is still that thing which has to be explained in terms of the global movement. That's also, by the way, why I hesitate in using queer, because it's very much a Western concept, so I hardly ever use it. But sometimes, like in these panels, it is the more common term. Like, I mean, a concept like sacred gender. Sacred gender is something that used to be very important in lots of communities in Asia, and I've studied lots of it in Indonesia, but it was also in Thailand, Korea, in Myanmar, in Philippines also. It is the kind of issue in which a priest takes up a trans persona, right? Or is a trans priest. The trans priest is seen as not only being of two genders in the human world, but particularly as the mediator between the world of the gods and the humans, and is therefore seen as much more powerful than cisgendered male or female priest. And in my research, one of the interesting things is also that the colonial administrators who encountered these kinds of priests, of course, they denounced them and said they were pagan and all that, but you can ignore all that racism. But they also described the conditions under which these trans priests, these trans healers worked, namely that they were highly respected in their communities and that materially they received sometimes 2 times or 3 times the amount that a non-trans priest would get for their services. So that just shows how important that was. And I mean, the issue of the trans priest, of sacred gender, is not seen as part of global LGBT history. It is seen as something alien, exotic, right? But it was prevalent in many countries. And I mean, you can continue with examples like this. There are many more examples. And what I'm advocating is you can only speak of a global LGBT history if you incorporate the experiences and the traditions and the histories of all communities in the world. And that is still not the case. It is still a matter of Western history is designed as global, and the other is the kind of derived history from that. And progress is seen if it is if there is some kind of movement into what the Western world sees as progress. And I'm against these kinds of movements.
Thanks, Saskia. I mean, there's so much in that. And I mean, leading on to that, I guess this is my final question before we go to the listener questions. Perhaps, Daniel, I can turn to you for this one. Kind of bearing in mind what Saskia just said, what do you see as perhaps the most pressing areas for future research then in this field, and how can emerging scholars contribute in meaningful ways given all the challenges that we've talked about, the structural challenges, the material challenges that you've already mentioned?
I mean, I think I guess having not, well, I finished my PhD in 2019, so not very far from where we are now. And I think one of the things that maybe just to respond to something that Saskia said, I think the constraints in which, under which students today have to do their PhD research are so desperately squeezed, especially when they're funding themselves, that it is not a surprise that they have only 6 months to disappear into the field to do that. And it's really hard to embed themselves. And, you know, I think the neoliberal in university under which we're now compelled to work is very much part and parcel of this system, the material ways in which which future research is going to be constrained increasingly. And, you know, people who are still researchers within academia are going to face this pressure in many contexts, wherever you are in your career. But, you know, I think one of the other issues that I feel like is increasingly present, and this came up in my research, and I talk about this in my book, which is based on my PhD research that came out last year, called Queering Normativity in South Asian Public Culture, Wrong Readings Only, is the complicated access to post-colonial queerness. Where and I think Mikee mentioned this in the way in which the hierarchy of oppressions plays out. Queerness often falls very late in how people can access resources, can access validation or identities for themselves. So when we're doing research in those areas, often nationalist agendas tend to marginalize or throw queerness out under the bus. And in some of the research that I was doing, looking at the ways in which the feminist movements in South Asia, and this includes the current countries of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, were marginalizing the woman question, often is now playing out again in relation to queer research, where this seems to be an extravagant act, given that there are caste-based implications for people doing research. There are class-based access. I mean, the privatized university is growing everywhere across different parts of South Asia. So I think that complicated access to queerness, and I prefer using queerness still, especially after I discovered that in 1960 Kamala Das, who's an Indian, a South Asian poet, was using queerness around the same time, and I was like, that feels reassuring, because that's part of the histories that we're part of.
Adnan, just before we go to questions, can I put that question to you about the future of this of queer studies and what contributions kind of emerging scholars can make?
The way I see it is that the future of queer studies lies in its ability to make itself relevant for the wider social sciences and humanities. And one of the ways it can do so is by offering its methods and concepts of disruption, its methods and concepts of transgression, its methods and concepts of disavowal, while being mindful of the fact that queerness, the way it is understood in the West, is often seen as this under the legacy of the queer theory, which is that sex gender subjects are always politically intentional, as if that people take up a sexual or gender subject position because they want to dismantle heteronormativity. But in my experience, because I've worked mostly with gender diverse communities, including heteros in South Asia, that is not necessarily the reason for why one takes up the subject position, because one want to live their life because it gives them pleasure, because for all sorts of reasons. So to not sort of presume or kind of make assumptions about why the kind of ends towards which people's identity constructions are geared. So I would say that it is in the ability of queer studies as a field to kind of make itself relevant, but not only just by offering its methods, unique methods and concepts, but also in terms of its ability to center other interlocking systems of oppression that are also central to how sex gender subject positions are constructed. So it is in that sort of way I see that the field will have a future, rather than being seen as the domain that pertains to only a demographic minority.
I know we could talk about the subject for another hour, but I want to turn to some of the questions that we've had in the chat, because they're really thought provoking. I'll read the questions out, and then if one of you wants to take it, please put your hand up. So this one's from Matthew. How can we help localize queer research and support queer researchers in global South countries where there are restrictive laws against LGBTQIA+ folks? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take a stab at it.
Go for it, Mikee.
There's various ways you can kind of approach this question, right? Because it's a question about funding. It's a question about resources. And I'm going to put my activist hat back on. As part of the International Trans Fund, our mission is to make sure that trans movements around the world are well-sourced, well-funded, able to do their own research, able to speak for themselves, and able to organize their community in safe spaces. What makes the ITF unique, I think, is that we are a participatory grant-making fund, which means that we only fund community-based organizations. And the way we select those fundings, those projects, is also with activists from the region choosing which grants get funded. So I think the participatory grant making model is something that is really important. Right now, though, because we have very limited resources, we don't fund a lot of research. We don't fund a lot of publications and a lot of these things that impact the way we, as a queer community, are seen in culture and all of that. So I think there's also a gap there that needs to be addressed, and I don't know how that is. We're trying to explore it at ITF. We're looking at state sponsoring and you know, state governments giving us money so that we can give that money to researchers in the global south and do that and do this kind of research. But it's, again, very, very limited and something that I think needs to be expanded.
Does anyone else want to comment on that question? Yeah, Daniel, go for it.
Yeah, I think one of the things. Oh, maybe Saskia wants to.
No,
go ahead.
You first, Daniel.
Okay, sure. So one of the things I was going to say is that, I mean, we didn't talk a lot, well, actually, we didn't talk anything about decolonization, even though this is part of the title. And I think a lot of the work that we've done through Queer Asia is about decolonizing the ways in which we access research. And of course, Queer Asia is just is a ground movement, you know, with barely any resources, no resources. We sometimes have even crowdfunded. But I think one of the important things on doing research within the local context and being embedded in this local context is to not surrender this power to institutions that have been part and parcel of the colonial apparatus. So I went to SOAS, which when it was inception, when it was formed in the University of London, was where colonial officers were trained and sent out into the colonies. You know, to produce knowledge and produce knowledge about people to be governed and very much enmeshed in governmentality. So we don't need to surrender a lot of this power to these institutions that are deeply embedded in processes of coloniality, even today, whether it is, you know, extracting fees from the global south if to fund these institutions in the global north, or other reasons. And, you know, embedding and doing queer research through communities and being part of those communities and telling, and, you know, Mikee said this earlier, right? Telling those stories and writing is something that anyone can do in their places. They don't necessarily have to seek that validation from an institution or transfer that validation, you know, I guess now at a price tag to those institutions. It was different when those institutions were, you know, publicly funded institutions.
Okay, Saskia, you wanted to come in as well?
Yeah, I would like to add something. I think this is a very important issue. What is the future? I think there are many futures, not one. And one of the important issues, two issues I would like to mention here. First of all, is the issue of that in many cases within the South itself, homosexuality is seen as a Western import. And that issue comes out again and again all over the world. And I think researchers, both in the West and in the Global South, can do a lot to refute that kind of issue by doing historical research. Because what is very clear is that trans and same-sex and same-gender issues have been prevalent all over the world in all our histories, wherever. And so getting out that kind of history in all its complexity and beauty, that I think is a very important issue with which we can all work together on that, going to our archives, doing this kind of research. So I think that is very important to point out the different forms and complexities in which trans, same-sex and same-gender issues have been manifest in many of our histories, but have been kind of erased. Another issue, I think, in which we should come together much more is in the anti-gender backlash that we now see coming up in many parts of the world, both from the Vatican and from Islamic societies and from fundamentalist Christian societies. And what is needed here is, I think, a South-South dialogues, well, many forms of South-South dialogues, and try to understand these kinds of issues, because I mean, these people, the Vatican, the OIC, and the Christian fundamentalists, control enormous resources. I mean, they come up with billions of dollars for their campaigns and their destabilization and their lying campaigns. And we don't have those kinds of funding, as Mikee also said. We have very little funding, but we do have our intellectual capacities in the sense that we can refute those kinds of arguments. And we can learn from each other when we are refuting these kinds of arguments, from listening to each other's ways of resisting this. And I mean, I know that my friends in Latin America, many of my friends in Uganda, in Ghana, in Namibia, in Botswana, in Indonesia, and in whatever, Thailand, they are faced with similar issues, and we can learn from each other. And I think these South-South dialogues are very important.
I think unknowingly, Saskia, you've actually kind of helped answer one of the other questions that's come in, which is from David, which was about this idea that you had on not idea, sorry, this point you made about queer identities are claimed in parts of the world to be a Western import, and the question was really, how can Western queer voices help lessen the risk of these as accusations? So you were talking about some kind of practical ways to do that. So if you don't mind, everyone, I'm going to move on to another question. So this one is from Anne, building on Daniel's earlier comment about materiality and who and how queer research is done. Anne wants to know, how have members of the panel worked with people who are not out or who want to protect their information and identity? Adnan, can I turn to you on this one?
I mean, I'm not really sure about the question, but if it seems like it's about like coming out of people that are closeted, how do you carry out research? I mean, if that's the question, then I think, it's about context. Like there are all sorts of contexts, where there are possibilities of same-sex eroticism, occurring precisely because of the homosocial configuration of the society. So, for example, South or Southeast Asian context, the fact of two same-sex or same-gender persons being together is not publicly accorded sort of any homoerotic connotation. So there are all sorts of ways that I mean, so it's, of course, there is this coming out process as it is practiced in the West, but it's just maybe one of the models, but there are also other ways in which, queerness is practiced and manifests itself. So I think, there are all sorts of subtle ways of reading and understanding it. But clearly there are ethical questions if you want to sort of research, because maybe for me, what is interesting is this assumption that is often made that people that want to sort of, remain in the terrain of ambiguity or obfuscation are doing so because there are no other option, But that isn't necessarily the case. For some people, maybe, being ambiguous is just part of who they are. And it is not necessarily something that has to be truth about it, and then you have to. So in a way, I mean, I think there are all sorts of nuanced ways of thinking about it when you take a cross-cultural sort of approach to this.
Does anyone else want to comment on this question? Perhaps have you worked with anyone else? So the question ultimately is, have people worked with people who are not out, who want to protect their information identity? I guess as Adnan kind of alluded to, this is a research ethics question, but perhaps in this field, has anyone got experience they'd be able to draw from?
Sorry.
Sorry, no, you go,
Mikee.
Mikee. Sorry.
What I'd like to do with my sex worker friends is I use their sex worker names. So not their legal names, you keep that protected. I don't even tell the university what their legal names are. I just use whatever name they want to be known as. So that's, one layer of protection that they have against possible backlash that whatever publications we have together might incur upon them. So that's one thing.
Okay, great. We've got 1 minute left, so I've got one final question that the organisers have asked me to pose. And I think, Adnan, you kind of alluded perhaps a little bit to it just now. This is from Lucas. I did my master's thesis on coming out stories of transgender queens on RuPaul's Drag Race from a context within the US. How are coming out stories framed, interacted with from non-Western contexts in this field? Does anyone want to take that? Well, Adnan, do you want to build on what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I could take a step, but see, I mean, I feel that yeah, I mean, of course, that's one of the ways, like we see the manifestation of queerness, and perhaps the idea is that coming out is this milestone moment through which the process reaches its political sort of apex, the process of politicization, highest level of politicization, and then I don't know. I mean, I feel that narrative is not necessarily, or would fly in the face of the complex ways people craft the subject positions, across the world, especially in the global south, especially in the context, where I have researched, where coming out is not about, it's not like a unilinear process of unilinear superstition. So, there are all sorts of ways that people come in and out of various subject positions. I've worked with Hijra communities, for example, and there are many Hijras who are heterosexually married. So in one household, they're operating as, householding breadwinners. And maybe in a Hijra, in a different kind of context, they're feminine identified, sort of, subject positions. So there is this constant movement in and out. And that is how, I mean, the process is. So by being adept in that sort of process, by learning to sort of move in and out, one can lay claim to a Hijra subject position. So it's not really something that is fixed. So maybe in the Western context is a little bit fixed. Even that might be a sort of a generalization about how it is, even in the Western context. But at least the standard narrative is that there is this fixity associated with coming out. But I think there is always this movement in and out, and so it's too complex from a non-Western perspective, I would say. And I think we need that kind of perspective, to challenge teleological narratives, to consider West as the ultimate site of queer liberation, So I think that's why this kind of counter narratives are really, really important, and we should mobilize them as often as it is possible. Yeah.
Okay, a call to action, everybody.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I mean, we could keep going, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So I'd just like to thank all our panelists for such insightful discussions, and I think everybody's got a little flavour, just a tiny one, of your research and your work and the thoughts you have on these questions. So we really thank you for joining us and explaining them. As I said, we'll be putting some links to the resources that we've mentioned. I think in what we'll be sending around after this webinar, and a recording of today's discussion will be sent around in a few days' time as well. So all that's left for me to say is thank you, everybody, for joining, wherever you are in the world, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.